At the beginning of their relationship, Stanley and Melanie seemed like the perfect couple, one that everyone couldn't help but admire. Their story was a charming blend of youthful passion and exciting adventures. They had first met at a summer barbecue 2 years ago, where Stanley's calm, laid-back demeanor balanced Melanie's fiery and bold personality. Within a year, they were married, eager to start their life together and build a future. But now, a year and a half later, things had started to fall apart. Stanley, always gentle and patient, was spending long hours at his accounting job, trying to make a living. He was the type of guy who showed love through little thoughtful gestures, leaving sweet notes on the fridge or planning quiet nights at home. Those small acts used to make Melanie smile and feel loved. Recently, though, no matter what he did, it seemed like she was never happy. Melanie, once full of energy and spontaneity, had become increasingly harsh and critical. She would start arguments over things that left Stanley completely confused. "You don't even follow me on social media, Stanley. You obviously don't care about me anymore," she snapped one evening as they were making dinner together. Stanley, trying to stay calm, replied, "Melanie, I'm here with you every day. Isn't that enough?" But Melanie wouldn't let it go. "If you really loved me, you'd be all over my posts. Why don't you want to be part of my life?" she demanded. Another time, she turned her attention to his friends. "You promised me you'd spend time with me?" she accused, her voice sharp with anger, when he mentioned his plans for a Saturday golf outing. "Clearly, they mean more to you than I do." Stanley tried to explain that everyone needs their own hobbies and friendships, but that only seemed to make her more frustrated. Even the smallest things, like forgetting to take out the trash, became weapons she used to lash out. "You're doing it on purpose, just to hurt me," she snapped. But the worst came when she asked a question that cut deeper than any of the others. "Are you cheating on me, Stanley? Is that why you've been so distant?" That accusation struck him like a punch to the stomach. Not because it was true, because it was anything but because it was so far removed from the person he was. Exhausted and at his wit's end, Stanley tried everything he could think of to close the growing gap between them. He suggested weekend getaways, proposed couples therapy, and reassured Melanie again and again of his commitment to making their marriage work. But every effort was dismissed. "There's nothing wrong," Melanie would mutter, only to spark another argument the next day. When the tension reached a boiling point, Melanie would storm off, either heading to her sister's house or meeting up with friends. Each time, Stanley was left alone in their cold, eerily quiet home, wondering how their once vibrant love had slipped through his fingers. The arguments became a brutal, predictable cycle, escalating from minor annoyances to full-blown confrontations. One evening, the fight started over something as trivial as a loose cabinet hinge Stanley had forgotten to fix. To Melanie, though, that small detail represented something much more significant. "You never listen to me, Stanley," she yelled, her voice shaky with anger. Sitting on the edge of their old couch, Stanley rubbed his temples, trying to stay composed. "Melanie, it's not that I'm ignoring you. It's just been a really hectic week. I'll take care of it tomorrow, I promise." "Tomorrow?" she snapped, pacing back and forth. "That's always your excuse. I'm done waiting for tomorrow. Maybe I'm just done with this whole relationship." "Melanie, stop," Stanley said firmly, standing up. "This isn't about a hinge, is it? You're angry, but you're not even letting me fix it. You're not giving me a chance." The word they both dreaded, divorce, hung heavily in the air, like a storm cloud threatening to break. Stanley hated hearing it, but it had been cropping up more and more lately. Each time, Melanie wielded it like a weapon, using it to cut deeper. Taking a deep breath, Stanley tried to steady his voice. "I love you, Melanie, but we can't keep going like this. We need help." For the first time in weeks, Melanie hesitated. Her usual fiery demeanor faltered as she slumped, her shoulders heavy with the weight of their unspoken tension. "You really think we need therapy?" she asked, her voice quieter now, less sure of herself. "I do," Stanley replied gently. "I think a therapist could help us communicate better, help us understand what's really going on. Melanie, I want to fix this. I want us to work through it." Melanie turned her head away, biting her lip, Maybe you're right, she muttered softly. But then she paused and added, almost as an afterthought, I'm not sure if I'm ready for that yet. Stanley let out a frustrated sigh, the mixture of hope and exhaustion clear in his voice. Then what are you ready for? Melanie's face suddenly lit up, as if a light bulb had gone off above her head. I need a break, she declared, practically beaming. A fresh perspective. Bethany and Paige have been planning a girls' trip to Europe for months. I could go with them, take some time to think, clear my head. Stanley was caught completely off guard. A trip to Europe? Now? Why not? Melanie replied, her voice insistent, almost challenging. It's always been a dream of mine. Paris, Rome, Barcelona. This could be the reset I need. We need. Stanley hesitated. This wasn't the kind of space he had imagined, but if it would help save their marriage, he was willing to consider it. How long will you be gone? He asked, his voice cautious. Just 12 days. Melanie answered almost too quickly, as if to brush off any concern. That's not so long, right? I'll keep in touch, I promise. Stanley frowned, still uncertain. You really think this is going to help? Melanie nodded, her smile barely holding. I do, and I think it'll help you too. We've been smothering each other, Stanley. Maybe a little distance is exactly what we need. Despite his discomfort, Stanley reluctantly agreed. Maybe she was right. Maybe a brief break would help clear the air for both of them. It wasn't an easy decision to make, but he wanted to show her that he was still trying, still trusting her. In the days leading up to her departure, the house buzzed with Melanie's excited chatter about the places she would visit and the adventures that awaited her. Bethany and Paige called constantly, planning every detail of the trip, laughing and gossiping like schoolgirls. Meanwhile, Stanley remained on the sidelines, his anxiety mounting with each passing day. Finally, the morning of her departure arrived. Stanley offered to drive Melanie to the airport, but she shook her head, the gesture quick and final. I need to do this on my own, she said, her eyes deliberately avoiding his. It's not that I don't want you there. I just need some space. Her words hit him harder than he expected, but he didn't argue. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded, though an uncomfortable knot formed deep in his stomach. Standing by the door, suitcase in hand, Melanie turned to him, offering a bright smile that seemed almost too carefree, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. This is going to be good for us, she said with an odd confidence. Trust me. Stanley forced a smile, trying to ignore the heavy feeling settling in his chest. I hope you're right, he replied softly. Just keep in touch, okay? I will, Melanie promised, leaning in to plant a quick kiss on his cheek. Without saying anything else, she walked out the door, leaving the house unnervingly silent in a way Stanley hadn't experienced before. He stood by the window, watching her car fade into the distance, his heart heavy with an overwhelming sense of unease. Just 12 days, he murmured to himself, trying to convince his racing mind. It'll be over before I know it. At first, Stanley tried to tell himself that everything was fine. For the first couple of days, Melanie replied to his texts, but her responses felt off, short and detached. When he asked how she was enjoying Europe, her answers were blunt and lacking any enthusiasm. It's fine. Or busy. Lots to see. It wasn't the Melanie he was used to, the one who would gush over every new place she visited. Instead of sharing her excitement, she seemed to be checking off a box, sending responses out of obligation. By the third day, her replies stopped completely. His texts went unread, and his calls went unanswered. Stanley told himself it was probably just because she was caught up in sightseeing, too busy to even glance at her phone. But by the fifth day, the knot in his stomach grew tighter. Looking for something to occupy his mind, Stanley turned to social media. Melanie had posted a few photos, pictures of famous landmarks, cozy cafes, and charming streets. The images were beautiful, but they felt strangely impersonal. Not a single selfie, no candid shots with friends, nothing that felt like it was shared with love or excitement. It struck him as odd, but he tried to brush it off, telling himself she was just focusing on the experience itself, trying to live in the moment. But his curiosity continued to gnaw at him. He decided to check out Bethany's and Paige's profiles. Normally, Bethany was all over social media, but she'd only posted a couple of updates in the first few days. Paige, on the other hand, had been posting more frequently. One post in particular made Stanley stop in his tracks. It was a group photo taken in a crowded piazza at sunset. Bethany and Paige were laughing, arms draped over each other's shoulders, looking carefree and happy. But in the corner of the frame, just barely cropped out, were two unmistakable male hands. A cold wave of unease washed over him. His stomach churned as he tried to push the thought away. They're in Europe. Of course they'd meet new people. It doesn't mean anything. But the doubt lingered, and the silence from Melanie only fueled it. Determined to quiet the growing voice of suspicion, Stanley couldn't stop himself from digging deeper as he scrolled through Paige's posts. Stanley's eyes locked onto a recently uploaded video. His heart skipped a beat as he clicked play. The footage was shaky, capturing a lively scene inside a crowded restaurant. The camera panned across a table where all three women were sitting, along with three men. Laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the background. Stanley froze the frame, his eyes immediately locking onto Melanie. Even though the image was blurry, there was no mistaking her. She was sitting next to a tall man with dark hair, leaning in toward him as they laughed together. Bethany and Paige were equally comfortable with their companions, their expressions relaxed and carefree. Before Stanley could fully process what he had just seen, the video disappeared. Paige had deleted it. His hands shook as he quickly opened his gallery, where he'd managed to snap a screenshot of the frame. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to make him feel like something was very, very wrong. For hours, Stanley stared at that single image. He couldn't accuse Melanie of anything outright, but her continued silence, now stretching into the fourth day, spoke volumes. By the eighth day, Stanley stopped trying to contact her. The sting of unanswered texts and ignored calls had become unbearable. Instead, he began mentally preparing himself for the inevitable truth. Whatever Melanie was doing, wherever she was, she had clearly checked out of their marriage. Sitting alone in their unnervingly silent home, Stanley's thoughts turned dark. He loved Melanie, but he couldn't ignore her secrecy, her lies, and the growing emotional chasm between them. He found himself imagining what their conversation would be like when she returned. He pictured a calm, almost civil discussion about divorce. He didn't want chaos or blame, he just wanted closure. Then, on the eighth day, something unexpected happened. Melanie's social media suddenly exploded with new posts. Vibrant pictures of cities, iconic landmarks, and colorful snapshots filled her profile. But there was something off. No group photos, no witty comments or playful tags with Bethany and Paige. It was as if she were traveling alone now. The sudden flurry of activity felt forced, like she was putting on a show. Stanley couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to distract him, creating a smokescreen to hide whatever was really going on. And the fact that she continued to ignore his calls and texts only made his suspicions burn brighter. By the next morning, Stanley couldn't stand the silence anymore. Against his better judgment, he decided to call Bethany. He'd always tried to avoid dragging others into their problems, but the weight of his growing unease was too much to bear. His first two calls went unanswered, leaving him pacing restlessly around the house. On the third attempt, Bethany finally picked up. "Hello." Her voice was strained, lacking its usual cheerfulness. "Hi, Bethany," Stanley began, clearing his throat. "It's Stanley. I hope I'm not interrupting anything." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Stanley? No, it's fine. How are you?" "I'm fine," Stanley lied, his fingers tightening around the phone. I haven't heard from Melanie in a while. I was wondering how you all are doing over there." Another hesitation. "We're fine. Everything's fine," Bethany replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "You know how it is. Traveling can be crazy. Melanie's probably just caught up in all the sightseeing and hasn't had time to check her phone." Stanley frowned, sensing something was off. "She hasn't replied in days, Bethany." Are you sure everything's okay? On the other end, Bethany let out a nervous laugh, the sound too forced. Yeah, everything's fine. We've just had a few hiccups. Like, we almost got robbed in Italy. And the weather's been awful, especially in Germany. It's freezing here, Stanley. And, the time difference is a nightmare. It's just been hard to keep up with everything. Stanley's frown deepened. Her rushed responses raised alarms in his mind. Bethany sounded like she was scrambling for excuses, and there was an edge of panic in her voice. But what really caught his attention was the faint noise in the background. Voices speaking English, the low hum of a copier, and the distinct ding of a microwave. It didn't sound like a lively European city. It sounded like an office. Germany, Stanley repeated slowly, testing her. That's pretty far from Paris. Are you all still traveling together? There was a slight pause before Bethany answered, her voice tight and strained. Yeah, of course. We've just been moving around a lot. Look, Stanley, I'd love to chat more, but I'm really busy right now. Can we talk when we get back? Before Stanley could respond, Bethany ended the call abruptly. He stared at the screen, his suspicions now turning into certainty. Bethany wasn't in Europe anymore. The background noise, the panic tone. It all pointed to one thing. Unable to sit still, Stanley grabbed his keys and drove to Bethany's house. He parked several houses away to stay out of sight and waited. The minutes dragged on into hours as he watched the quiet street. Finally, as the sun began to set, Bethany's car pulled into the driveway. Stanley slumped in his seat, his heart sinking even further. Bethany stepped out of the car, dressed casually with her hair tied back, carrying a takeout bag in one hand. She didn't look like someone returning from a European adventure. She looked relaxed, almost carefree. She disappeared into her house, leaving Stanley sitting in stunned silence. Piece by piece, his worst fears were being confirmed. If Bethany was back, then where was Melanie? And why hadn't she told him? His mind spun with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. He thought about confronting Bethany right then, but quickly dismissed the idea. There was no way to know if she'd be honest with him, and he didn't want to expose his suspicions too soon. On the drive home, Stanley's thoughts spiraled further. Day 9, he muttered under his breath. She's supposed to be in Europe, but Bethany's already back. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, knuckles turning white. I can't keep pretending everything's fine. Melanie and I are going to have a serious talk when she gets back. The next day, Melanie finally texted him. I'm fine. Just been busy. The vague message only deepened his frustration, but Stanley forced himself to remain calm. By the 11th day, she called. He picked up on the first ring, his voice steady but betraying the tension in his chest. Hey! Hi, Stanley. Melanie's voice sounded soft, almost hesitant. I'm sorry I haven't been in touch more. It's just, there's been a lot going on. Some problems here, and honestly, I've been feeling off sick, even. I didn't want to worry you. Stanley's grip on the phone tightened, but he kept his tone even. I get it, he said. Traveling can be exhausting. Are you feeling better now? Better, Melanie replied with a tired sigh. I'll tell you everything when I get back. I miss you. I'll see you soon. Okay? Okay, Stanley said, but the knot in his stomach only tightened. When Melanie returned on the 12th day, Stanley was waiting for her. He had spent the entire morning pacing the living room, his mind swirling with anger, doubt, and disbelief. Over and over, he replayed the last 2 weeks. The silence, the deleted video, Bethany's sudden return. It all pointed to the same conclusion, but Stanley wasn't sure he was ready to face it head-on. The front door finally opened, and Stanley stood rigidly, his arms crossed. Melanie walked in, dragging her suitcase behind her, a wide, almost forced smile on her face. Before he could speak, she rushed toward him, throwing her arms around him. Stanley, I've missed you so much, she exclaimed. Her enthusiasm felt hollow like a performance. She immediately launched into a rapid-fire recounting of her trip. It was so hard, you know? The weather was awful. We ran into all kinds of trouble. We tried to make the best of it, but it just wasn't the same. Stanley opened his mouth to speak, but Melanie barreled on. And the food didn't agree with me. I felt sick half the time. That's why I wasn't answering. I didn't want to worry you. It was just all too much. She paused, placing a hand on her stomach like she was gathering her thoughts. But, Stanley, there's something I need to tell you. His heart raced as he stared at her, the worst-case scenarios flashing in his mind. I'm pregnant, Melanie announced, her smile wide and triumphant, as if she'd just revealed the most joyous news. That's why everything's been so strange. The mood swings, the nausea, it's all hormones, Stanley. Please, don't be mad at me. Stanley froze, her words hitting him like a thunderclap. Of all the scenarios he had prepared himself for, this was the last one he expected. You're pregnant? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his mind racing. Yes. Melanie's eyes sparkled, brimming with expectation. I know it's sudden, but it's amazing, isn't it? We're going to be parents, Stanley. But Stanley couldn't process her excitement. Suspicion, which had been simmering for days, refused to let go. Slowly, his expression hardened. Melanie, he said carefully, his tone firm yet restrained. I need to be honest. I'm having serious doubts about your faithfulness. Her smile vanished in an instant, replaced by a fiery glare. What? She snapped, her voice sharp and defensive. What are you even saying, Stanley? Are you just scared of being a father? Is that what this is? Coming up with wild accusations to avoid responsibility? That's not it, Stanley replied, his voice steady but heavy with frustration. What I'm afraid of is that this child might not be mine. That's why I think we need a DNA test and a conversation about divorce. Melanie's jaw dropped, her face twisting into a mix of shock and fury. Divorce? She spat. You're accusing me of cheating and threatening to end our marriage, all because I'm pregnant? You're unbelievable, Stanley. No, he said coldly, his gaze unwavering. What's unbelievable is the way you've been acting. Ignoring me for days, lying to me, and then Bethany coming back early without saying a word. And let's not forget the video page posted, the one she deleted. Something happened on that trip, Melanie, and you've been hiding it. Melanie's hands clenched into fists, her face flush with anger. That's absurd. You're being paranoid, Stanley. I can't believe I'm even hearing this. I thought you'd finally pull yourself together, but clearly, I was wrong. Taking a deep breath, Stanley steadied himself, his resolve unshaken. I'm done, Melanie. If this child is mine, I'll be a father and take care of my responsibilities. But I refuse to stay in a marriage built on lies and distrust. The DNA test isn't negotiable. For the first time, Melanie faltered. Her confidence cracked, her hands trembling at her sides. Your suspicions are ridiculous, she snapped, though her voice wavered. Completely unfounded. Yes, Bethany came back early, but that was my decision. I told her not to tell you because I knew you'd overreact like this. You're being dramatic, Stanley. Stanley crossed his arms, his expression unyielding. And the video? He asked, his voice sharp. The one showing you with other men. Care to explain that? For a moment, Melanie's eyes flickered with panic, but she quickly shifted to defensiveness. Oh, for God's sake, Stanley. Those were just locals. We met them at a cafe. They were curious about America, so we chatted. That's it. Nothing happened. Nothing happened? Stanley repeated flatly, pulling out his phone and showing her the screenshot from the video. This doesn't look like just a conversation, Melanie. And even if it were innocent, this whole trip doesn't resemble a girl's getaway. Melanie's face hardened, her expression icy. You have no proof, she hissed. You're projecting your fears onto me because you're terrified of becoming a father. You've always hated change, Stanley. The problem isn't me. It's you. Stanley clenched his jaw, his patience finally snapping. Don't insult my intelligence, he said, his voice sharp with anger. You've dodged my calls, ignored my texts, and now you're spinning this elaborate story. Your behavior has been shady from the start, Melanie. Throwing her arms up in frustration, Melanie shouted, "My God! Who did I marry? You're acting like a controlling, insecure man who can't handle his wife having a shred of independence. And now you want to accuse me of cheating? You're going to regret this, Stanley." "What I regret," Stanley fired back, his tone cold and resolute, "is trusting you when I shouldn't have. Your lies and manipulations have eroded this marriage beyond repair. Divorce is the only way forward." Melanie's face crumpled for a split second before her fiery glare returned. "Divorce? All because I didn't coddle your fragile ego?" She spat, her voice trembling with anger and tears. "Yes, we've been fighting, but I thought you were better than this. I thought you could rise to the occasion." "Rise to the occasion?" Stanley snapped, his frustration boiling over. "This is either a lie to manipulate me, or that child isn't mine. So which is it, Melanie? Pick one." Her eyes filled with tears, and she screamed, "You'll regret this, Stanley. You're throwing away everything we've built." She stormed toward the door, yanking her suitcase behind her. But before leaving, she turned back, her expression venomous. "If you don't apologize by tomorrow," she hissed, her voice icy, "you can pack your things and get out. I'm not going to let you stress me out and risk this pregnancy. You've got until tomorrow." With that, she slammed the door behind her, leaving Stanley standing in the suffocating silence of their home. Stanley didn't wait for the morning. Without hesitation, he grabbed his belongings, shoved them into a bag, and walked out. He wasn't going to beg, and he wasn't going to play Melanie's games any longer. The motel room he checked into was small, sterile, and impersonal, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the house that had become suffocating with tension, lies, and deceit. The following day, Stanley went to see a lawyer. He laid everything out: his wife's silence, the lies, the manipulations of the past few weeks. The lawyer listened carefully, taking notes as Stanley spoke. "It sounds like you've already made up your mind," the lawyer said, his voice steady but acknowledging the gravity of the situation. "I have," Stanley replied, his voice firm, a note of finality in his words. "I can't stay in this marriage. Not after everything that's happened." When Melanie found out Stanley had filed for divorce, her shock quickly morphed into fury. That evening, she called him. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the line like a blade. "You think you can just walk away like this?" she spat. "You're not going to ruin my life, Stanley. I'll fight you every step of the way." "Fight all you want," Stanley replied coldly, his resolve unwavering. "But I'm done with this marriage, and I'll get to the truth about that child, one way or another." Melanie didn't back down. Over the next few days, she unleashed a storm of emotional chaos. She bombarded Stanley with texts and calls, her tone shifting from tearful apologies to venomous threats. She even reached out to their mutual friends, painting Stanley as a cruel, controlling husband who was running from his responsibilities. She hinted at taking legal action to keep the house, claiming it was in the best interest of her baby. Melanie's tactics escalated. Her family and friends rallied around her, spinning a narrative that Stanley was a coward who couldn't face fatherhood. Rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers that Stanley was avoiding the reality of his unborn child, that he was too weak to handle his responsibilities. Everywhere Stanley went, he could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on him. People looked at him like he was the villain in his own life. Through it all, Stanley remained steadfast in his belief. The pregnancy was either a manipulation or the result of infidelity. Then the trial began, and the truth Stanley had feared the most was finally revealed. Melanie was pregnant. Stanley had hoped it was a mistake, a lie, or some cruel twist of fate, but the doctor's reports left no room for doubt. She was expecting, and the weight of the situation hit Stanley like a tidal wave. This wasn't the end of his battle, it was just the beginning. His lawyer wasted no time addressing the lingering questions about the child's paternity. In court, they laid out the inconsistencies between the timeline of Melanie's pregnancy and their private interactions. Long stretches of conflict, estrangement, and Melanie's European trip raised serious doubts. Had it really been just a sightseeing vacation? Or had something else been going on? Melanie's legal team, however, was well prepared to counter. Her lawyer crafted a narrative that painted Stanley as emotionally distant, neglectful, and terrified of becoming a father. Melanie's family, friends, and a select group of witnesses testified on her behalf, reinforcing the idea that Stanley was unfit for parenthood. They painted him as a man who had failed to support his wife, leaving her to carry the weight of their marriage alone. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Each side worked tirelessly to discredit the other, turning their private struggle into a public spectacle. Melanie's lawyer portrayed her as a victim, an innocent woman abandoned by a husband too immature to face his responsibilities. Meanwhile, Stanley was cast as a neglectful, arrogant spouse who couldn't be bothered to support the family he had created. The damage to Stanley's reputation was severe. Every accusation, no matter how baseless, seemed to gain traction. Melanie's supporters spread rumors that Stanley was hiding from fatherhood, too ashamed or afraid to confront his future. Despite his lawyer's strong case for doubting the child's paternity, Stanley could sense the judge's leanings. The judge, a stern and experienced man, seemed to view Melanie as the aggrieved party. He appeared skeptical of Stanley's claims, dismissing suspicions of infidelity as speculative and unsupported by concrete evidence. At a pivotal moment in the trial, the judge addressed Stanley directly. "I understand your concerns," he said, his tone calm but firm. "But suspicions alone are not enough. Without clear evidence of infidelity or a stronger basis for doubting paternity, these remain speculative. A DNA test is the appropriate course of action." Stanley's heart sank. It wasn't the decisive victory he had hoped for, but the judge agreed to a paternity test, only after the child was born. Though it wasn't a clear win, it offered a sliver of hope for clarity. On the matter of their shared property, the judge ruled that Stanley and Melanie would continue to live in the house together until the baby's birth and the paternity results came in. Final decisions on property division and finances would be postponed until paternity was definitively established. Melanie was granted temporary access to the home. While Stanley was relieved the court had acknowledged the importance of the DNA test, he knew this was just a temporary reprieve. The battle ahead would be long and grueling. Outside the courtroom, Melanie's family and friends continued their campaign. The rumors kept spreading, painting Stanley as a heartless man running from his responsibilities. Everywhere Stanley went, he felt the weight of judgment. Whispers, glares, and assumptions that he was the villain in this story. Through it all, Stanley clung to his belief that the pregnancy was either a manipulation or the result of infidelity. The months ahead were not just about his marriage. They were about the truth, the future of the child, and the fight for justice. Determined to protect his sanity, Stanley spent the rest of Melanie's pregnancy avoiding her as much as possible. He moved through the shared space of their home like a ghost, speaking only when necessary. He marked the days on his calendar with quiet resolve, waiting for the moment the child would be born, and with it, the chance to uncover the truth. As the due date neared, Stanley felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The waiting, the lies, the rumors, they had all led to this. For better or worse, the truth was coming, and Stanley knew it would shape the rest of his life. When Melanie gave birth to a baby boy, the sight of the newborn stirred unexpected emotions in Stanley, an odd combination of tenderness and sadness. But he remained firm in his resolve. The DNA test would answer everything. 2 weeks later, the results arrived. Stanley's heart pounded as he opened the envelope. His hands trembled as he read the document carefully. His suspicions were confirmed. He was not the father. Relief washed over him, but it was tinged with simmering anger. All the lies, the stress, the rumors, they had been for a child that wasn't his. When Stanley shared the results with Melanie, her reaction wasn't what he expected. Instead of lashing out or denying it, her face went pale. Her voice quivered. "What?" she whispered, her eyes wide in disbelief. "No, this can't be right. That's impossible. You have to be the father, Stanley." "I'm not," Stanley replied flatly, holding the results up to her. "It's right here. The test doesn't lie." Melanie's shock morphed into desperation. She demanded a retest, her voice pleading, almost frantic. "There's been some mistake at the lab," she insisted, her eyes wide with panic. "I don't understand. I know it's yours. There's no way it isn't." Stanley remained calm, his voice cool and detached. "Go ahead," he said. "Do the retest if you want. But it won't change anything for me." Weeks later, the second test confirmed the first. The child was not Stanley's. This time, even Melanie couldn't deny the truth. She broke down, her body shaking with sobs. Still, she insisted she had no idea how it could be true. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. But by then, Stanley no longer cared. Her explanations felt like meaningless noise. He had no energy left to untangle the web of lies she had spun. With the DNA results in hand, Stanley moved forward with finalizing the divorce. He made sure Melanie had no further claim to his life, his property, or his future. But for him, that wasn't enough. The months of slander, the damage to his reputation, these couldn't be left unaddressed. Stanley filed a defamation lawsuit against Melanie and her family for the lies they had spread about him, painting him as a coward, an irresponsible man who couldn't face fatherhood. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through Melanie's circle. With the DNA results as undeniable evidence, Stanley's case was airtight. Melanie's family's falsehoods were laid bare, and many of the friends who had once rallied around her began to distance themselves. Though the legal battle dragged on, Stanley ultimately prevailed. He received both a public apology and financial damages for the harm done to his reputation. For Stanley, it wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming his dignity, putting a final end to the story Melanie had tried to weave about him. 2 years later, Stanley's life had transformed completely. He had moved to a new city, started a new job, and was dating again for the first time in years. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. The weight of the past had finally begun to lift, and the future felt like a place he could start to build again. One afternoon, while grabbing a coffee at his favorite cafe, Stanley ran into Paige. The sight of her dredged-up memories he'd long since tried to bury. Paige, though, seemed nervous, almost guilty, as she hesitated before approaching him. "Stanley," she said, her voice unsteady after a bit of small talk. "I owe you an apology. I should have told you the truth back then." Stanley raised an eyebrow, intrigued but wary. "The truth?" he asked, keeping his tone cautious. Paige sighed deeply, looking around as if checking for prying ears. "Melanie, she had a lover. She didn't go to Europe with just us. Bethany and I knew about it, but she swore us to secrecy. We didn't think it was our place to say anything." Stanley's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to stay composed, his voice low. "So it wasn't just a girl's vacation?" "No," Paige admitted, guilt flickering in her eyes. "She'd been seeing him for a while. We didn't know she was pregnant, though. She must have thought it was yours." The revelation hit Stanley like a punch to the gut. Vindication mixed with frustration, and something colder, anger, perhaps, simmered beneath his calm exterior. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, his voice measured but thick with emotion. "Because it's been eating at me," Paige said, her tone heavy with regret. "You didn't deserve what happened. I guess I just wanted to clear my conscience." Stanley nodded slowly, taking a moment to process her words. There was no joy in this truth, no satisfaction to be found in hearing the confirmation of his suspicions. "Thanks for telling me," he said quietly. "But honestly, I'm not surprised. I've already moved on." They parted ways, and as Stanley stepped back out into the street, he felt a strange sense of closure. The truth he had spent so long chasing had finally surfaced, but it didn't weigh on him as he expected. It didn't sting or feel like an open wound. Instead, it simply confirmed what he had already known deep down, that he had made the right decision to walk away from Melanie. For the first time, the past felt like just that. The past. Free from the shadows of betrayal and lies, Stanley looked ahead to the future with clarity and hope. He was ready to embrace the life he had worked so hard to rebuild, one step at a time, without the weight of Melanie's lies holding him back.